Welcome, everyone. I see you all joining us from the waiting room. I'm going to launch a quick poll so that we have something to do while we wait for everybody to join us. If everybody wants to look at their screen, they're going to see a poll, and I'll let you fill that out. So the poll is, do you feel more comfortable with face-to-face or virtual communication? And the options that you can choose from are virtual, face-to-face, or it depends. I'll give everybody a few more moments to settle in. We'll let a few more people in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started with today's session. Okay. So today's session, how to connect genuinely in a virtual world. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to end the poll that we have on the screen, and I'm going to launch the results so that everybody can see what they are. And it looks like the winner is it depends with 80%. I don't think that surprises anybody here. And we have 15% of the people in the room who do prefer virtual communication, and we have 5% who prefer face-to-face. Okay, I think we're going to be unpacking that a bit more throughout today's session, that's for sure. So a quick overview of how to interact with us today. So many of you at this point are very familiar with Zoom. Welcome to everyone. So with our session today, we do ask that you keep your microphones muted for the best sound quality because we are recording today's session. But just because we're recording and ask that you keep your microphones muted doesn't mean you can't interact and engage with us. So one of the easiest ways to do it is through the chat feature. So I'm going to get everybody to give that a try. If you want to open up your chat, and if you want to comment where in the world you are joining us from and what the weather is like there. Here in Victoria, we love to talk about the weather. It's a common conversation, and I'm joining you from Victoria, BC, located on the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and Songhees ancestors and families. It is sunny, it is warm out, it is a beautiful day. I'm going to go for a walk after this webinar, and I'd love to hear where you're joining us from. Awesome, I see people commenting in the chat. And another feature you can use to interact with us throughout today's session is the reactions feature. So you can test that one out as well now. If you wanted to give me a thumbs up, you give me a round of applause, which I'm sure you'll be using a lot throughout today's session. You can give me a heart, whatever you feel like. Awesome, I see that everyone's doing that. That's wonderful, perfect. And feel welcome to use the chat and the reactions throughout the session. The chat, if any questions come up, just pop them in there and we'll do our best to answer them. And before we continue with today's presentation, it is so important that we do an acknowledgement of traditional lands. Royal Roads University acknowledges that the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and Songhees ancestors and families. It is with gratitude that we now learn and work here, where the past, the present, and the future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. Today's session, how to connect genuinely in a virtual world. I'm joined by Dr. Chaseten Remillard, Associate Professor and Head of the MA and On-Campus BA in Professional Communication. And this is where we do a round of applause emoji reaction as well. And I'm also joined here by Dr. Geo Takach, who is the Associate Professor and Head of Blended BA in Professional Communication. And my name is Imara Angus, and I'm an Education Advisor. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to quickly go over the agenda, and then I'm going to pass it on to Chase and Geo. So today's agenda, a welcome and get to know one another. So I now know what the weather is like, where you're joining us from. I know where in the world you're joining us from. And I have another question for you, just so that we can see who's in the room. So I'm going to launch another quick poll. So everybody look at your screen. And I'm going to launch the next poll question. So the poll question is, who's in the room today? And on this one, you can select that all that apply. So it's not just one option. You can select all of them if they apply to you. So the options are alumni, current student, interested in taking a program at Royal Roads University, first time meeting Royal Roads University. We mean that in the sense that maybe you found us in an event calendar, or you've never heard of us before, but you found out about our event, a friend of Royal Roads, you're part of the community, you like to attend our webinars, Royal Roads staff or faculty, And if you select none of the above, please comment in the chat what the right answer is, because we'd love to get to know you better. Okay, I'll give the poll a few more seconds and then I will end the polling. Okay, I'm going to end it now. All right, I'm going to share the results here. Awesome. So we can see 39% of people are either staff or faculty. So we really believe in professional development at Royal Roads University. There's a lot of people behind the scenes as well supporting us. And the next winner is 33% of people being a current student and 22% being friends of Royal Roads. And I know that many people might have selected more than one option. Thank you so much for answering the poll. So the next part of the agenda is a presentation. We're going to go through the theory and practice of online communication, followed by a question and answer, and then followed by what's next. All right, is everybody ready? Give me a thumbs up with the reactions feature if you're ready to go. Wonderful. Okay, over to Chase and Geo. I welcome you up here.
Thanks, Amara. That was awesome. And thank you for all joining us today. It's great to know who is all in the room. Briefly about me, I'm Dr. Chaseten Remillard, but at Royal Roads, we all go out by our first names or our nicknames, and that's Chase for me. And yeah, I'm the program head for the BA PC online or on campus, which is now online, you know, because of COVID, but normally it would be on campus face-to-face, and also the MAPC, which is the Master's in Professional Communication. And I'll turn it over to my colleague Geo to introduce himself before we launch into what our thoughts are on this question around how to connect genuinely in a virtual world.
Thanks, Chase. I'm Geo Takach, colleague of Chase's. Our former school director dubbed us the Bapsy Brothers, branded us, I should say, because I'm in charge of the blended version of the BAPC program, in addition to teaching and the odd bit of light janitorial work on the weekends. During this time of physical distancing, Chase and I feel the need for human connection is more important than ever. And in planning for this seminar, we noticed that we considered that many people and organizations simply apply best practices from traditional face-to-face without considering the unique characteristics of the virtual space. So our challenge now is to create virtual spaces and workplaces that can function as authentic, connecting environments that are conducive to participants' safety, satisfaction, and effectiveness. You.
Thanks, Geo. So we're going to lead off with a little image that you may or may not recognize. Anyone know what that? I mean, I think the slide is going to tell you what it is, but anyone seen that movie? Because that's not the radio play. So that's a movie with the esteemed actor Tom Cruise, right? So, which fun trivia fact, apparently I have like a second cousin in that movie who I've never met, who played one of his children in that movie. So I didn't put that as like a little plug for my celebrity status, that I know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who worked with Tom Cruise. But in 1938, right, in 1938, the day before Halloween, this radio play went out, and it was Orson Welles' adaptation of H.G. Wells, no relation, War of the Worlds. And like, what's the standard sort of, I know there's some students in the room and some alumni, so what's the standard sort of interpretation or the reason why this radio play is brought up by communication scholars all the time? Does anyone want to throw out an answer there? Geo, maybe. Oh yeah, it was real, right? Exactly, Lisa. It was totally, people thought it was real. And Geo, Geo pointed out to me the other day when we're putting this together that might be an exaggerated, might be more of a Trump fact than maybe a real fact about how many people were actually running out into the streets and claiming that Martians had landed. But nevertheless, there was a reaction by people who were listening, and some of them felt that it was real. And the focus for most communication scholars on that event is that it is like an example of how propaganda is dangerous, right? That the content of this message went out synchronistically, people received it, and people freaked out and ran out. So it's a focus on the content. And what I would actually like to do is just sort of step back a little bit and use it as an example from the perspective of someone like Marshall McLuhan. What we would like to look at it from that perspective is saying it's actually a very important lesson from the point of view of the dominant medium of the time. And to look at it more from that perspective of the medium and not necessarily the message. And I know that Geo has got a great slide with a fancy machine that he's going to chat about here in a second.
Mara, that's your cue. Thank you very much. Artful segue, to be sure. The word telegraph comes from a Mediterranean language, which is, Greek to Chase and I, but tele meaning distant and graphene meaning to write. So what is it? Well, a telegraph is any device or system transmitting information by coded signal over a distance. And over the centuries, actually, many telegraphic systems have been used for short range communications. For example, smoke, fire, drums, reflected rays of sunlight. Signals from flags and torches were in fact used well into the 20th century, notably semaphore by the Navy. But the term is used most often to refer to the electric telegraph, developed in the mid-19th century by a number of different inventors from a number of different places. And basically, it converts bursts of electric current into coded symbols, for example, dots and dashes in Morse code. Why do we care, you might ask? Well, we say it's actually profoundly consequential invention and technological development, because for the first time, communicants, the communicator and the communicatee, have been separated over really long distances from the message itself. So this did two things. It condensed space. You could go across oceans. You can't do semaphore that way. And it also compressed time because the message was relatively instantaneous. Now, Chase mentioned a distinguished scholar and Canadian figure earlier, so we'll move to that next.
Yeah, so you probably have all heard the medium is the message, right? Like this is a very classic articulation that is oftentimes associated with communications in general, and it's just sort of an aphorism that is also connected to Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan was a good Edmontonian, then went on to do some work in the States, then came back and was at University of Toronto. And in 1962, he wrote the Gutenberg Galaxy. I should also put a little caveat on this, that Marshall McLuhan's also one of the only writers that you may actually, in an academic setting, read Playboy literally for the article, because one of his most famous articles was first published in Playboy magazine. So he was sort of this public intellectual. There's a famous story about how one of his books came out and was misprinted. The medium is the massage. And he's like, that's okay, I'll just create another theory to match the title. So he's just sort of one of these people who came up with these really great insights, but slightly less maybe systematic in his use of data than we would be now, much more philosophical. And basically one of the things that he does is he rewrites the history of humankind from the perspective of communication technologies, right? And what he says is that the telegraph introduces the electronic era. And this is why we're getting sort of a little bit of history here, is because really, in many ways, what McLuhan talks about with the telegraph and what Geo introduced hasn't really changed very much, right? We have this electronic medium that allows us to transmit information at a very rapid pace and at an extreme distance. And for McLuhan, that's most important. So the medium of the message is a statement to keep in mind when we think about the fact that for McLuhan, it doesn't matter if it's the War of the Worlds and Nyan Cat, some TikTok video, or the works of Shakespeare being broadcast. It matters very little. What matters is that the electronic medium is the one that is the most prominent and dominant in our world. And we could even go one step further and say that maybe we've transgressed that into like the digital, and now we move from the electronic to the digital. But needless to say, it's really important theoretical kind of concept for us to hang on to, because it allows us to remind ourselves that each of these different platforms has a particular bias. It has a particular sort of way of shaping our society and shaping our interactions. And one of the most famous examples of that was the debate between Kennedy and Nixon.
Yeah, let's flash forward from the Telegraph to 1960 and the first presidential debates in the US. There are actually 4 of them between these two characters. Not only did this have an impact on the election, the fact that it was televised, but it signaled a new era where crafting a public image and taking advantage of media exposure became, for the first time, key parts of winning political campaigns. Also announced the vital role of TV in the democratic process. So what did Nixon and Kennedy talk about during this debate? Nobody remembers that very much. They talked mostly about the Cold War, which loomed large at that time. But the biggest takeaway for communication scholars, and here we're biasing towards McLuhan, is the telegenic aspects of the debate. That's what the analysts are all over. Nixon, recovering from the flu, lost 20 pounds, suffered a knee injury in a car, refused makeup, killed him, wore a gray suit, providing little contrast with the background set, had 5 o'clock shadow, perspired profusely and palpably, and those are just the P's. In contrast, au contraire, JFK, dapper in his dark suit, already tanned, but made up anyway, relaxed, coached on how to sit with his legs crossed, knew what to do when he wasn't speaking. Look over at Nixon. Nixon looked off to the side during the Q&A to address reporters' questions, which is, an old politician's trick. You look at the people talking to you. Big mistake on TV when you're creating the impression among your viewing audience that you're actually looking away from them and therefore not telling the truth. History would prove the audience right about 13 years later when Watergate blew up, but I digress. Kennedy stared directly into the camera as he answered his question, spoke to the TV audience. Each performed very well. They had remarkably similar political agendas. Most radio listeners called the first debate a tie or thought that Nixon won. However, the 70 million astronomical audience, even by today's standards in the 500 channel universe, preferred Kennedy's showing by a wide margin. 6 weeks later, the election, record voter turnout, Kennedy won the popular vote 49.7 to 49.5%. That's a 0.2% margin of victory. And polls showed that more than half of the voters were influenced by the debates, and 6% claimed the debates decided their choice. So there you go. But at the end of the day, whether or not the debates lost Nixon the presidency this time, it was a major turning point in the race and in the history of media. And this is probably wondering, what's this got to do with communicating in a virtual world? In a world, everything, because media matter.
Exactly. And one of the things that we've been talking about right now is this sort of deep structure implication that McLuhan brings to us. He's literally talking about the history of the world, and he's saying that as new technologies kind of introduced into society, it rewires society so that we as individuals are kind of like, in a way, powerless to the dominant medium. When the dominant medium becomes television, it shapes the way we literally see politics. there's other theorists that also think of the way in which technology impacts us on a more personal level. So like in the next slide, you'll see that there's a little cartoon, which you may or may not be able to read, but it essentially says, do you mind if I put your phone on my forehead so that you look at me while we're having dinner? And this, we all can relate to this, the idea that we're on our phone in our face-to-face conversations. You're probably there 2 or 3 screening it right now. I would suggest that, again, just hands up, how many of you have your computer open, maybe another screen behind it, but definitely your phone going? You might even be in a variety of different conversations as we currently talk. You might be talking to your kids about something by text. You might be talking to your spouse about something by text. You might be colleagues by text. How many people are doing that? And hey, I won't take any offense. Yeah, Geo is doing it right now openly. Sorry, right? So this phenomenon is Sherry Turkle's sort of place, where she adds some interesting insight into this, and she has 2 sort of key theories I think are important for us to remember. The first one is that this idea of being alone together. So her first sort of premise is basically that we've gotten to a situation in which we've kind of created these technological bubbles around ourselves in a way that we can be within society, but also shielded from society. So I saw that Dr. Zhang Li was in the room, and he and I know have had a lot of conversations about earphones and the use of earphones. But the fact that you can kind of arm yourself with earphones, your phone, and you can walk out into society, and again, like, no judgment, because we've all done it. You could literally walk through a mall or a shopping center, your kid's graduation, and not talk to anyone, right? Like, you can literally be in this bubble where you're in a completely different space than where you are actually physically. So there's sort of this alone togetherness that Turkle speaks to. And she also speaks to this weird absence and presence. And this absence and presence is a lot of people talk about like the virtual self and the real self and online persona and offline persona, right? But this absence and presence kind of speaks to this shattered identity that we experience, that we're both present physically somewhere and absent from that presence because we're also online. And then when we're online, we're obviously not online. We're absent from being online as well. And it also speaks to this weird relationships that we tend to have, or I shouldn't say weird, but this sort of complicated or nuanced relationship that we have with time, that we're not only having a conversation, like you're listening simultaneously to what I'm having to say, but you're also simultaneously having a conversation with somebody who's not there, to a conversation that you might have initiated 3-4 hours ago, right? So you might have sent a text to a friend this morning saying, hey, do you want to go for drinks tonight? And they're responding to you in real time now saying yes, but that conversation is this long it's drawn out. And so both of these things are psychological or like individual sort of agent elements of how the shift in technology creates a scenario in which our interactions, not only just on these broad policy and politics level, but also on an individual level, are being shaped by the very technologies that we're using to communicate with each other. So it's not just as McLuhan points out, that we're having these things reshape our societies and our politics. It's also that it's reshaping our expectations about what constitutes intimacy, or what constitutes politeness, etiquette, all of these what constitute as romance. Can you break up with somebody on it with a text message? Can you romantically pursue or woo somebody through text message? Well, yeah, you can do all of these things, and it's changing those definitions of how we interact individually, not just on a more general societal level, as McLuhan kind of points out. And this leads us to this sort of classic like conflict that Geo has a really interesting slide that he's going to show you next, between sort of man versus machine, right? Or human versus machine.
Okay. In the next slide, we see the term technological determinism. Big university word, right? But what does it mean? Well, really brings to home for me what we do at the university and at Royal Roads in particular. We've been talking about things here. We've been talking about issues concerning the relationships among people, society, culture, and technology. But now we sort of step back and we ask ourselves, you know, what assumptions are we making? How do those assumptions affect the way that we think and govern ourselves? And then we question that. That's what university is all about. The term technological determinism. So now we're going to look at, I'm going to interrupt myself. Now we're going to look at, okay, what lens have we been looking at the world through and speaking to you through? There are many, many different ways of looking at the world. And the point of view we have been espousing could be accused of being technological determinism, which is coined by an economist, sociologist called Thorsten Veblen from the States. He argued that in any society, technology does two important things. First, it defines the culture and the values of society. And second, it determines the course of history. Example, the gun changed the face of combat. Steam power led to the Industrial Revolution. Camera phones and selfies led to scenic sites and national parks being trampled. There are only 3 examples. So what's the critique? Is there a critique of this perspective? Is it the only way of seeing the world? Certainly not. Or as the great scholar N. Dynamite said, heck no. Technology, while certainly influential on our communication, you could argue doesn't wholly determine what we communicate, nor determine our history by itself. But there's a struggle there, Chase, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a struggle. There's like a classic sort of communication question for me, which is, where does meaning come from? Where does our interactions and the way in which we understand the world come from? Is it given to us through the systems, and technology would be part of that system? Or is it shaped by the medium to such an extent that Turkle suggests that we're losing our capacity for intimacy, that we interestingly, to the poll, that we actually feel more comfortable in virtual meetings than we do face-to-face meetings? And I'm interpreting that because the context question takes a bunch out, but there was a strong determinant between those two, that actually, just in our straw poll here, people felt more comfortable in a virtual meeting than in a face-to-face. And so, because, and this is the next slide, Amara, like Zoom is not face-to-face, right? We're in this scenario where now, I think what's really been very interesting for a lot of folks, us included, is the fact that the technology has been forefronted in the pandemic. It's always sort of been running in the background for most of us. And we may, if we're interested in communications, we may have been thinking like, oh, isn't that interesting how blah, 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 or Turkle says this, we might have read some things. But for most of us, because we moved into these virtual spaces, all of a sudden our interface with technology became first and foremost. Like, we were forced to have to reconcile the fact that no longer were we going to have face-to-face meetings, we had to have virtual meetings. And I would sort of suggest to you reflect over your course of the last year, and the sort of, my narrative is sort of like the novelty of this, then all of a sudden the sort of like the informality sort of sets in, different protocols set up. You can see that there was a loosening of ways in which people interacted. People were less concerned about what they showed in their backgrounds. People were less concerned that their kids busted in or their dogs barked. There was all of these strange sort of adjustments that had occurred because of the very fact that Zoom is not face-to-face. And because of the face-to-face, there's a context in which we have to meet. And we know that communications is shaped by that context. And so we're again, from Turkle's perspective, we're in this very strange space because it's a private space, right? I'm looking directly into Geo's house. You're looking directly into my house. But at the same time, it's ultimately a public space. And in fact, it's almost an impossibly public space, because there's no way, I don't know how many people are in the room, but this space that I'm in now would comfortably hold maybe 3 people, not any more than that. So to have you in this space is impossible except for the very fact of technology. And so technology as a medium, right? Or the technology allows us to have this communicative medium. It changes a lot of things, and it changes also the bandwidth, if you like. Like face-to-face communication has a very broad, like it sends a lot of information, right? It's sort of, I kind of think it's like the gold standard of information that's being transmitted, because you're getting smell, you're getting physical touch. If there's haptics there, you're picking up on all kinds of nonverbal cues. You're getting the room, right? There's a shared experience. Then you're getting the words that's being spoken, the tone that's coming across, right? So each technological piece of technology that we have from communication kind of strips one of those down or adds another one back, right? So writing just gets down to the words, and then radio adds the tone of the voice, and television adds an image, and now we're at this point where we're having a synchronistic back and forth, which we couldn't do with a broadcast, but we're still missing things like I can't reach out and touch Geo, I can't smell his cologne, or I can't, we can't collectively hear or see the same things in the room. So we're still missing an avenue of information there, but we're getting sort of close. And that is what McLuhan is really trying to hit upon, is the fact that this medium is different in some important ways. We could call that platform bias. There's particular platform biases that come with each different platform or each different medium that we're using to communicate. And so we should be aware of those biases as professional communicators, because we want to leverage those biases to our advantage, and we don't want to be disadvantaged by a blindness towards that bias. And secondly, we also have expectations, right? So this is sort of to Turkel's point. We have these personal expectations that we bring to this virtual space of what constitutes a good meeting, what constitutes a good presentation, what's my role, what's my privacy, where's my public, right? So it's not just that the platform exists there, but also there has to be a recognition that there's an individual kind of rule book that's being rewritten from the point of view of us, that we have expectations too. So again, as a professional communicator, we want to address those expectations of that particular space. What are the expectations of audience when we're engaged in a Zoom meeting? That's really important for us to know, because that then allows us to construct an environment that is welcoming, inclusive, and that leverages all of the possible opportunities that come with the platform, and also is cognizant of the lacks of that platform. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Geo. He's got a couple of really great opening points here around preparing the virtual space and establishing ground rules. And now we're going to get into the practice part of things, which is maybe what you signed up for. And haha, we slipped some theory in there for you to start off.
Well, theory and practice, where do you separate them, right? If you understand the theory, we feel it can really improve your practice and give you a lot more options. And for the record, I do not engage with Cologne, although I have been to Munich. Now we're gonna share 4 kind of propositions for you, implications for practice, recognizing that this could be an entire course, but we've got just under half our time together left. So fasten your seatbelts. Here we go. The first one is to, first of all, establish ground rules for your virtual interaction. In communication, we learn don't assume. And in Zoom, for example, a virtual meeting platform like this one, we can't assume that everyone is fully conversant with the platform, nor even basic etiquette like muting, especially during lunchtime. So you saw Amara, professional that she is, treat everyone in the audience as first timers, even though you're not, probably not, most of you, and briefly whisked you through some of the features that we use. you can talk about cameras being on and off, the use of a chat box. We'll talk about more about that later. The name that is put up in front of your image in Zoom, or no image at all. You want to create an environment providing some semblance of structure while still allowing for flexibility. There are always tensions, right? We always have to find the right balance for us and our group and our audience. And we want to respect the autonomy of process as well as people. We want to encourage open, honest communication and invite people to share their thoughts and questions and concerns whenever possible. And Amara spoke about some ways we're going to be doing that at the beginning and after in particular. We want to engage as many participants actively, as many as possible. Why? Because clear communication helps build and foster trust. And that's a key part of successful virtual meetings. As Chase said, we're not in the same physical space. We've got to work harder to earn trust from within a device. Which brings us to this notion of, in the next slide, of preparing the space that Chase set up for us. And here is where I will have the most to share with you. So I'm going to try to do, if you hear my voice pick up in speed, you'll know why. We're really talking about three things here. The physical space, the virtual space, and yourself in terms of preparation. As far as physical space goes, we'll go over some of the obvious things. Lighting, natural light feels warmer, more comforting. Avoid having a light source behind you or beside you because it casts a shadow and makes you look sinister. Try to keep the light at the eye level. A proper camera angle is important. The eyes should have a direct line of sight to the camera. We've all seen people angle up where we see, yeah, thanks, Jace, where we see ceiling up people's nostrils or zoomed in views of their face, or I was at a presentation a couple of weeks ago where I saw, kind of a forehead across the eye line, and that is distracting. Ideally, you're straight on and you let your audience see you approximately from halfway mid-torso on up. You can do it a couple of ways, and we're modeling examples of that for you today. You can surround yourself with comforting and tasteful objects like plants and books and art that energize you, or you can keep it completely neutral. There's also a blur function, right, that people can use. We can talk about backgrounds in a bit. You want to minimize the distractions. The biggest competition, I think, to successful virtual communication is your inbox. So mute or turn off your notifications for email and chat on all devices. I think I deliberately left mine off, hoping that you would hear it go off, and it did go off, at which point I turned it off. We've all had that happen. Commit to avoiding, if you can, social media, gaming, online gambling sites, these sorts of things for the duration of your meeting. You don't want either your physical or your virtual environment to be cluttered or distracting. Pre-test all your technology in advance, check that you can be seen and heard, ensure all your devices are charged or plugged in, and have a backup plan. For example, if you can't share your screen in a presentation, at least have a link handy to visuals that are stored somewhere else online. You can just throw the link into a chat box. That's physical space. As far as virtual space is concerned, well, backgrounds, yeah, people use them. They block out, things like piles of laundry, your bathtub, prison bars, but they can distract, right? I've seen people use video moving waves, and I'm just sort of ignoring them, and I'm entranced by the waves, or their ritzy decor in their Parisian apartment. The pretty scenery they have in the background. All these are gorgeous, of course. And if people know you, and you're just talking to friends, it's one thing. If you're meeting them for the first time, it's making a statement. And if that's think consciously about whether that's a statement that you want to make. Of course, we all learn that we have to lock or barricade the door from curious pets or bored partners in their pajamas. Because when they get within 2 feet of the camera, of course, you may have seen this phenomenon, they pop unexpectedly through the virtual background. It's quite striking and occasionally hilarious in a way you maybe don't want. Multitasking is tempting again, but I have to do a shout out, and I was part of an experiment that proved this. you can't do two things simultaneously as well as you can do them separately, no matter how good you are or think you are at multitasking. So maximize windows to hide distractions, only keep essential notes or information on or near the screen. Last part of this is yourself. Prepare yourself. We know there are fewer visual cues in a remote meeting situation, but we should keep in mind just how much of our communication is nonverbal, most of it. Body language and nonverbal communications can reveal a lot about ourselves and our level of engagement, and by inference, as Nixon created an inference by looking off camera. It speaks to the regard we have for our audience and the priority we have for this gathering. So your physical presence, postures, gestures, and eye contact, they all affect your ability to connect. And they help to build and reinforce trust and communication, and making the communication potentially more impactful as well as more efficient. With clothing, you want to avoid busy patterns and large eccentric accessories and scarves that can distract again from you and your message. It's tempting, especially in year 2 of the pandemic, to dress casually. But consider dressing like you dress for work. It'll make you feel like your typical professional self if your gathering is professional, and certainly help the audience feel like some semblance of business as usual. And try not to read throughout, try to look at the camera as much as possible, but also read your audience. A confused look, uncomfortable shifting in a seat, fidgeting fingers. These are obvious, more obvious certainly in face-to-face meetings, but subtle hints to speakers could go unnoticed in a virtual platform. So do look at the gallery view periodically and pay attention to your audience if they are on camera. And yourself, to avoid fidgeting on a virtual call or to release stress or tension, experts recommend stretching or a physical warm-up before you sit down or stand up for the meeting. Do a vocal warm-up, keep some water nearby, and jot down some reminders. So a key to this is authenticity. It is to establish and to maintain a climate for authenticity, and that's what Chase is going to share with us now.
Yeah. So on the next slide, I'll add to this whole idea of kind of ground rules and creating a space with this idea of cultivating authenticity. So authenticity is one of these words that's really sexy right now. If you do an online search on how to grow followers on Instagram, or what to do for social media, one of the big words will come back will be authenticity. So what does it actually mean when we talk about authenticity? Well, authenticity, I think, really can translate to the idea that you're real, or that you're actually there, or that people are seeing you in a way that's not overtly like performative, right? Even though you are performing a version of yourself. So I think that there's some things that you can do to cultivate authenticity in an online meeting scenario. I think number one is to like what Geo said, is to sort of dress and act like you would otherwise at work. So or how you otherwise would with that group of people. So, I think informality is okay, but I think it's also important to recognize that most people want or expect, and this is again audience expectation, a separation between the public and the private. We have an expectation of that back door or backstage self, and that we don't necessarily expect people to give us. So if I think an easy question for you is, does the space behind me, or does my interaction in that space make it seem like I'm disclosing too much personal information about myself? Because then that's a line maybe that you're crossing. But at the same time, it's not, I'm of the opinion that it's not a bad idea to have something that reflects your personality in the background in a way that complements that cultivation of sort of who you are in terms of your personality. So it could be that you choose to showcase certain things, and I think a good actual, for those who've been watching the NHL playoffs, there's like a good kind of range of different perspectives on this on Hockey Night when they have the Hockey Night in Canada panel. They have Cassie Campbell, who has a very clean background. She's very much like Geo, where she has a very clean background, and then she accentuates her personality and a kind of authenticity through her clothing. So she's always wearing different clothing, very sharp looking business, casual kind of clothing, and that speaks to her personality and her sort of like Zoom brand. Then you have someone like Kevin Bieksa, who he's always wearing, like, he always wears essentially the same thing, because it's, they're hockey players, so they're wearing like suits and jackets and ties and collared shirts. But he changes his background every time, and he tailors, adds a little bit here, takes a little bit away there. So part of his brand is sort of the idea that you're never quite sure what's going to show up behind him. It all is the same shelf. It all fits on that shelf. But there's sort of like a kind of playfulness there that says, look, things are in motion. I kind of change my mood from time to time, and I'm going to present my different sort of versions of myself and kind of showcase my career through what I'm sharing in the background. And then you have Kelly Rudy, who he has very much like what I have. He has a static background. It's always the same. He uses it to highlight things that are important to him. So he has his degree up on the wall. He has a picture, of his wife and him when they're younger. He's got important sort of books that he sort of likes or maybe is mentioned in. He has some personal things from his family, and he's used it to sort of create a scene for himself that speaks to sort of who he is, and again, his brand. And I think thinking about your brand as a mechanism to create this authentic self is a very good strategy, because it allows you to think about strategically what you want to showcase in that space and who you want to be in that space, but not in a way that is artificial or fabricated, but one that reflects your personality, your humor, your warmth, your whatever it is that is sort of a key feature for you. It's like it allows that, and that speaks to what Geo has been talking about in terms of preparing that space. So whatever you do, it has to be organic to you, and it has to be conscious. And that's part of what we try to train people in our programs, is to be conscious communicators and not just gut reaction or unconsidered communicators, but to be conscious and to be strategic about what you're communicating. We're running low on time, Geo. We've been talking too much.
See, if we just, would have mimed the thing, at an accelerated pace, we'd be done by now. Create safe and inclusive spaces. Just a couple of words. We'll keep it short here, but the empathy, the compassion, and the grace that you show will reflect very well on you as a communicator. The science of personality suggests that when conditions are normal, we are more likely to act on our best attributes and our best behavior. But when we're under stress, we tend not so much to be at our best. So when, I won't say if, I'll say when stressful opportunities arise, we can use that opportunity to reach out, show our caring side, and build relationships and allow for time in the proceedings to do that, as Amara did off the top of this. We could have launched right into it at the crack of high noon, but we would not be putting forward our authentic selves. I submit we would be putting forward robotics. The onus is on us as communicators to create interactions with participants, and if we don't engage you, you'll be multitasking if you're not already. So chat box, polls, breakout rooms, emojis, all these things Amara mentioned are tools of the trade in Zoom. A couple of final things: avoid jumping to conclusions. Sometimes we can't see facial expressions or hear tones of voice or see surroundings as well as virtually as well as we do in face-to-face. And that makes us more likely to jump to conclusions or be less likely to give people the benefit of the doubt. For example, if somebody comes late, we can assume they're disorganized or they deprioritized the meeting, but they may simply be having technological issues. So cut people some slack and be intentionally empathetic. Ask questions to engage with people, check on them, acknowledge that they're there. Final point coming up on synchronous discourses and the need to keep them that way.
Yeah, again, I think we've talked about this a little bit all the way through, but I think one of the things that you want to be aware of when you're a presenter is the fact that this platform allows you a different type of interaction than you would in a face-to-face setting. So in a face-to-face setting, you're not able to easily have cross-table conversations. You're not able to have side conversations. And so again, as a presenter, you may choose to use that to your advantage, or you may choose to have very clear ground rules that you would prefer not to. So in this example where we have Amara and Christy in the room, they're able to manage the chat very well for us while we're presenting, and so that allows us to be able to speak more like scripted into the camera. But if you're running it on your own, you may be very conscious about the fact that there's different discourses happening along the same time. So you might mention something in which then there's going to be a back and forth that happens in the chat. And I would actually encourage that not to be quarantined. I think in the presentation scenario, that can become distracting, but I think it's really important that you actually acknowledge that the platform is there to create that space. And there might be some really interesting and important stuff that comes out of the chat. And we tend to prioritize the people who come on camera and ask their questions. And we also prioritize discourse that aligns with the topic that we're talking about. But I would suggest that the platform actually has an opportunity there to gain insight into things and to understand dynamics, even within a group or a team setting between people that you might not otherwise know of, because it's a completely different channel there that's happening. So this idea of synchronous discourses is really one, just again, to be very mindful about the fact that there's different conversations occurring simultaneously within the same room. And maybe that's actually a good thing. And to think about creatively how you can use that to your advantage, either as in a role of leadership or in a role of pedagogy, or as a mechanism for building better team dynamics and better inclusion. And we'll wrap it at that.
I'm just going to jump in here. I know Amara is going to, I've worked with her enough, she's going to say, Tricia has a question. Tricia's question is an excellent question about incorporating land acknowledgement in virtual settings, which Amara did at the beginning. But to me, it's a great question because it raises a bigger issue of cultural considerations that arise when you're comparing face-to-face and virtual. For example, we have a brand new course in our BAPC program that we're just launching next week for the first time, called Communication in Indigenous Contexts. And it is debuting in our online program. However, we are bucking the trend and turning it into basically a synchronous course, trying to emulate face-to-face in a way that's more congruent with the subject matter of the course. If you're talking about communication and Indigenous concerns, face-to-face in many Indigenous communities is an important way to communicate in a circle. Face-to-face is it. So how do we adopt a key consideration that Russell Johnson, our Indigenous education advisor, and I, who put this thing together, came up against repeatedly, is how do we honor that inside of a virtual space? So the question of the virtual space is as important to us as the content of the course, which brings us back to Chase's point about through McLuhan, via McLuhan, that the medium is the message.
Thank you so much, Geo and Chase. That has been so informative. Part of me is trying to do the back end of this presentation, and the other part of me is trying to lean in and learn and listen. So we'll see how the multitasking goes, right? So I have one more question for you, and then we'll continue kind of with the closing of our session today, as well as sharing with the room other ways they can connect with us and learn more from us. So the closing question I have is, there's been some concern around what it does to the individual to have to look at themselves while having a conversation on Zoom. Do you think this concern is valid or will impact how we communicate moving forward?
No, I don't think so. And maybe I'm naive and a bit of an optimist, but I think historically there's always been a pushback against technology. So when writing came around, philosophers were talking about how it was going to ruin memory. When radio came around, people talked about how it was going to ruin abilities for people to read. When television came along, people were nostalgic for TV. As you know, when social media and YouTube comes along, all the parents are nostalgic for the good old days when kids could just watch, you know, one of the 3 channels and there was Sesame Street. Despite the fact that when kids were watching one of the 3 channels and Sesame Street, there was royal commissions on the impact of television on children because people were worried about it impacting children in negative ways. So, you know, one of the a bigger and more important factor on whether or not somebody is having a good day or not is not the number of hours they spend online, but whether or not they have breakfast. That's like a well proven stat. So I think the long and the short of it is that whenever there is some kind of new technology that changes our expectations around interaction, there's a whole chorus of people who suggest that it's going to somehow erode our ability to be human. And yet, hundreds and hundreds of years have gone by since new technologies have shown up, and we still manage to get married, we still manage to have children, we still manage to fall in love and out of love and write beautiful things and paint beautiful things. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's going to definitely change what we consider to be a normal business interaction. Yeah, it's weird for me to be looking at my face while I'm talking to everyone else. And if you don't like it, you can mute the camera. You know, it's a possibility. I think it definitely will have an impact on self-perception, and it will change that. But I think that it also is probably exaggerated. But again, you know, time will tell. But I just suspect that it's not as big of a deal as perhaps other people think it will be.
Thank you. That's a really refreshing perspective on it, because I was wondering about the impacts of hosting all these webinars and seeing my face every day. So thank you for reassuring me that I'm going to be okay. And so moving on, I know people in the room might be interested in how they can learn more about communication. So I'm going to go to the next slide where we're talking about sample courses, and I'll pass it back to both Chase and Geo, as you're the program heads of these programs, to just talk briefly about the sample courses, as well as we'll show you the different programs you can do through School of Communication and Culture.
Sure. The material we've spoken about today can be found in these courses that you see on your screen, both in our Master of Arts program and our Bachelor of Arts program, which the latter is offered in both blended and on-campus formats. We're hoping to return to on-campus next year, but as Chase mentioned, currently everything because of the pandemic is online. And on the next slide, you will see a listing of all of the programs and certificates that are offered through our School of Communication and Culture. And there's such a beautiful interrelationship between communication and culture, but that's another webinar.
Great. Well, we'll have to do that next webinar. That sounds great.
Yeah, I like that topic, actually.
Okay, well, stay tuned, everybody. We'll be doing that webinar, date and time to be announced.
You shouldn't open your mouth in these things. This is one of my takeaways.
Awesome. So here, I'm just going to just the last slide. If you do want to get in touch with us, being mindful of time, I know we're at the end of our session today, but if you are interested in a program, you want to learn more, please connect with us. Enrollment advisors, here's the phone number and their email, as well as we have upcoming webinars too on the BA in Professional Communication and the MA in Professional Communication. I popped the link in the chat there, and I'll share it out in the follow-up email where I share the recording from today's session. So if you're interested in exploring those programs, please attend our webinars or connect with us. And Chase or Geo, is there any final words you'd like to share with everybody in the room today? And thank you again for such an informative session.
Thanks for coming. And I would just say, don't be afraid of it. Have fun with it, be creative, try new things out, and, see what happens. Sometimes they'll work, sometimes they won't. And be a great, be like all great artists, copy other people. And, when you see something that you like, just incorporate it into your own meetings and into your own protocols.
Thanks for sharing your day with us. We appreciate your being here. Hope you got something out of it. Happy communicating.